Hello, my name is Val Worthington, and this is the sixth in a series of conversations I'm getting to have with some friends of mine who train Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. And since we can't train with each other during the pandemic, I have decided to ask them about the other amazing and interesting and useful things that they do um, in hopes to share some information and reduce isolation while we're all dealing with the pandemic. And today I get to talk with my friend James, who is a police officer in the Philadelphia area. And James, you and I have known each other for many years, right? And have trained together and all those good things.
Yeah, I'd say it's probably over a decade at this point now, yeah.
I think so, both online and in person. And you are a black belt, and so that means that I can't really boss you around because we have.
Technically, you outranked me, though.
Is that true?
You're a third degree, I'm a second degree.
Okay, well, all right, so that's good to know. So if this chat goes south, then just be prepared. So
Fair enough.
I want to thank you very much for chatting with me. You're a police officer in the Philadelphia area, and I thought it would be really useful and enlightening to chat with you about what you're seeing. So the first thing I wanted to ask you was pre-COVID, what was a typical day at work like for you?
So I'm a patrol officer, so most typical days are calls for service. That could be handling accident reports, theft reports, police info requests, you name it. We go to medical calls. We basically do everything that a specialized unit wouldn't do. So we would be the front line for everything.
Okay. And what has changed since the pandemic has happened?
So I can only speak for my agency, but for example, we've had schedule changes. So they've now changed up how we're deploying officers. So we now have more squads. So we've pulled guys out of they're still detectives, but they're also handling patrol functions as well, just to provide, basically a force multiplier. And we're working longer days in a row and then having more days off. The logic being that if somebody were to inadvertently get COVID, it would give them time to quarantine and not potentially risk infecting the rest of the department. We're still being paid the same, but for example, some days we're not going to be at work, we're going to be on call. So basically our entire day is revolving around possibly responding in should somebody go down. But what they've done now is instead of having 4 patrol squads, they've now made 6. So they have less guys on each squad, but they have more squads covering, if that makes sense. So that, in terms of our actual deployment, has changed. In addition, we're basically taking more of a how do I put this? We're being more present. A lot of agencies, for example, are not trying to engage unnecessarily if it's something minor in nature. The way that we're handling certain crimes, for example, and I'm sure you guys have read this in the news with certain agencies, is that if it's something where it's not violent in nature or it's not going to have any detriment to the public safety, say for example like a minor theft report, a lot of that can be taken over the phone rather than having an officer respond out directly. If it's something where it's more major, for example like domestic violence or obviously anything like an aggravated assault or a homicide, it's still going to be handled the same way. So we're trying to use as much common sense as we can so as not to obviously risk anybody's health, be it the officer or the public. But I know a lot of misinformation was going around that the police aren't responding in general, and that's certainly not the case. I can just speak for my agency. We've increased basically patrols around areas where we deemed might be potential to have some sort of risk. For example, like obviously grocery stores, convenience stores, gas stations, banks, any place where during this pandemic it's still considered an essential business. Obviously, if we're not engaging as much as the public or engaging as much with the public, it still gives us time to do more business checks overnight. So anything where there's potential to have theft, construction going on, a lot of people steal scrap metal and stuff like that. So short of that, I mean, we're still essentially doing the same thing. We're just doing it in a different manner, if that makes sense.
It does. And can you give an example or two of some situations that you've seen that are a little bit different or notable, or that it would be useful for people like me, the public, to
know? So, for example, we are getting a lot of how do I put this nicely? There's a lot of Karens calling around with complaints of people not possibly social distancing. And obviously, it's a good practice to let people know. I don't want to sound like I'm an authoritarian. Oh, let the authorities know. But if it's something where I'm sure you've seen in the news, like there were some issues in some towns where people were massively gathering. That's obviously a problem. And by many state governments, it's been deemed through an executive order that they're not allowed to do that. I'm sure the police departments would want to know that. But for example, I responded to a call for, I think it was like 20-year-olds who were sitting outside in lawn chairs at a safe social distance, wearing masks, enjoying the sunlight. And a woman called about that. And she's like, well, I don't think they're following the executive orders. I'm like, well, I've read the executive orders and they keep constantly changing, but I don't think the majority of police departments want to do it where it's an enforceable action. They just want to say, hey guys, let's use some common sense. Please move along. But in that case, they were in compliance with the order. It was a group under 10. Yes, they weren't quote unquote staying at home, but a lot of the orders themselves are conflicting. People are allowed to passively exercise. I know in certain places they have closed parks, but that doesn't mean you can't go outside to walk your dog or get some fresh air. In many cases too, because people are home, for example, a lot of the school districts are doing like these caravan parades where they're visiting their students, and people are calling on this. They're saying, oh, well, there's a lot of people gathering. Right, but just because there's a group of people gathering in their cars at a safe distance doesn't mean they're actually gathering and violating the order. So some people need to either read the order better or maybe think, is this really a necessary action to take for the police? I'm not saying don't call the police if you feel that that's the case, but it's sort of hard navigating these waters, particularly when we have, important calls to go on, like, for example, medical calls or traffic collisions, and that we still have to respond to these in addition to it. It makes it kind of difficult for us, especially since many places are having skeleton crews of officers already to handle calls. Does that answer your question?
It does. Thank you. And it raises another question for me, which is where can people go to read these orders? Where should they be looking for the most up-to-date information?
To be honest, it's like really hard to even keep track of it because every day it changes. But I would encourage you to check your state, local, and county health departments, your emergency services. A lot of these pages can be followed on Facebook, Instagram, or Twitter. And from what I've seen, a lot of the ones that are on Twitter are basically just the facts. There's no kind of political spin or opinion to it. So I would encourage people to follow their Department of Transportation, their local road service, their public works, police departments, fire departments, etc. You could even probably follow like your National Guard, and even, for me, I've followed surrounding towns, counties, and states, just so I have an idea of what's going on and I can make the best decision.
Great, thank you. So another question that comes to mind is not just with law enforcement officers, but just in general, there seems to be a lot of information being passed around, some of which is maybe more credible than others. And I am curious about what you think it would be if you could share with the public what you think it's important for people to know from the perspective of law enforcement. What do you think needs to be shared that maybe isn't being shared, or that may be being shared sort of in a way that's not 100% accurate?
I mean, it's difficult to say. Obviously, people have their opinions. Some people have different political beliefs and ways that they view things. I think from what I've seen on social media and in the news, there is some misinformation going around, particularly even in the case when they were talking about the Philadelphia PD, when I guess somebody had leaked that they were changing their responses. Immediately people jumped on the bandwagon saying, oh, well, like Krasner's letting the criminals out, or the police aren't going to respond. And obviously sometimes they're just looking at the headlines, but then when you read through it, for example, they never said they weren't going to respond for carjackings. People misinterpreted what a carjacking was, and they read theft from auto. So theft from auto is somebody opening your door and maybe taking change, or ransacking your car. And I doubt that people are listening to CDs anymore, but something along those lines. A carjacking is somebody actually taking your car, in a violent manner. So it requires people to take a step back and wait until like either read more about it or until the truth actually comes out. Obviously, the information is coming out so quickly, and it's not always accurate. And sometimes the media likes to be first. But if you take the time to actually read the article, if you say something, that doesn't sound true, let me look into it further before I just share it, that usually helps. And I think that kind of helps to reduce anxiety too, because you're not sitting there thinking, oh, well, the sky's falling down, or the police have some sort of nefarious thing where they're going to collect all this information about us. I know another one that I saw was that, well, the police are collecting information on COVID patients before they respond. I think some of these programs in some states are voluntary, but a lot of it is just merely putting a flag on the residence before an officer or medical personnel is dispatched to say, hey, this person tested positive for COVID, which would make you take extra precautions with your PPE, your personal protective equipment. Obviously, for certain calls, like I can give you an example. I responded to an overdose a few weeks ago, and we rushed overdoses. Obviously, police sometimes usually get there before EMTs or medics and fire. And we also have naloxone, commonly known as Narcan, that we can administer. And we have basic first aid training. And in my department, we carry oxygen, and we have what they call rebreather masks or bag valve masks, which basically is that it goes over your face and you squeeze it with the O2 tube, and it gives you oxygen. That usually helps get the Narcan through the sinus cavity where it absorbs. We rush into those calls because obviously it's somebody who's not breathing. Come to find out, as we got there, the person had tested positive for COVID. I would have liked to have known that when we got there. We didn't actually go in. He was up and walking by the time we got there. So we gave ourselves safe social distance, and then we went and threw our masks on. And obviously we had our gloves on at the time, but it's changing up how we're responding too. We have to sort of slow down on our approach, put our gear on, give us a second to do this, and then go in there. So having the knowledge of that for a house, for example, would help medical responders. We didn't know who the patient was. People are saying this in such a way that they're making it sound as if we're gathering all this data on people and we're going to hold it forever and violate HIPAA laws. And that's just not the case. Just reading our own policies from our county, there's certain stipulations, like we don't know who the person's name is. The dispatch supervisor has this information. They have it in a database, and all they're saying is, hey, that address, has been flagged for a public health issue. Make sure that you wear proper protective equipment. It's just giving the officers or the fire department or whoever responds in a little bit more information. And I have a feeling that they're going to probably, from what I read, clear that information out once this pandemic lifts. So it's not where they're holding it forever and then they're going to use it against somebody in a negative manner. I understand how some people view law enforcement and how they think, the more information you give them, that's going to be used against them. But all of these things are being done in a legal manner. So I guess it's really going to fall into where you feel in the spectrum of whether you like law enforcement or not. Me personally, I would like to have that information because I have family members who are immunocompromised, and that would just help me do my job better. If I go down, then I can't go to work, which means now we have a slower response rate, and then we have more officers, or less officers rather, handling things that more officers should be handling. So it has the tendency to, it could devolve if we aren't taking the proper precautions. I can just speak from my agency that we are now required anytime we deal with the public to wear masks and gloves. So, I mean, for us, it's a no question. We're going to don that equipment anyway.
So there was a time before COVID, you were wearing gloves, and now when you're responding to calls where there is an actual I guess intimate interaction where you have to go into someone's home or you have to physically interact with somebody, you're donning gloves and masks. Is that?
Yeah, and if it's something where it's a definite case of suspected COVID or coronavirus, I've taken it upon myself to wear my own goggles as well. Like we have goggles for shooting and for our trainings and stuff like that, just to keep obviously my eyes safe. And I have a face shield that goes over one of my ballistic helmets. So if it's something where I know that's the case, I'm going to wear the face shield as well personally, because it's going to potentially prolong the shelf life of my N95 mask too, because that's what people have been recommending now because of the shortages. So there's a lot more to think about. And, in a decade of being a police officer, I had a pretty good system down. Now it's like I'm having to learn everything. Okay, even when we go to like certain priority calls, most officers, as they're responding, they're already getting themselves mentally ready. Like, what am I going to do now? Okay, so if we know it's a medical call, as I'm driving, I'm probably putting on my gloves. You know what I mean? If it's a person with a gun call, like I'm already starting to roll down my windows slightly so I can hear better. Maybe turn off my lights before I get there. So I'm having to change how I respond now, and it's a learning curve. So I have to consider all these extra steps that I may need to do in order to respond safely to a call.
Can you mentioned a couple things that you would normally do when you're responding. Can you name a couple of things that you have to do that are part of your learning curve now with COVID?
So I can only speak for my squad, my sergeant and I, and the other people. We kind of debrief and try to figure out how we can do it better. Generally, when we respond to a medical call, for example, we might just arrive, throw on our gloves, and go in. It's usually pretty quick. Grab the naloxone, grab the medical bag. The issue now is to properly don a mask. It takes a little bit of time to get that on. So what we've kind of come up with is we maybe stop like a few blocks before the house, get the equipment on, and then shoot over. Because the last thing we want to do is show up where it's already a tense situation, have like a family member come out screaming, freaking out, why are you taking so long? Why are you not doing anything? And then running up to us and then potentially infecting us. So it's a lot easier just to slow down the response for like a few seconds, put the proper equipment on, and then as soon as we show up, we can get right out of the car, already wearing our equipment, ready to go. So they think we just got there and we can get right to business.
So really striking, it sounds like you're really working hard to strike a balance between proper protocol for you to keep you safe, and also making sure that you're providing the services that everybody needs when they call the police in the first place.
Right, right. I mean, generally, police are first responders, so most police departments are trained in basic CPR and first aid. My department's gone a little bit further. We've also gotten training in like bleeding control and hemorrhage control, but we get dispatched to medical calls as well. Some of the bigger cities usually don't go unless it's a priority call, and I understand that. But we're responding to most medical calls, fall victims, et cetera. So we're coming into contact, and we're usually having to assist our EMS and fire department. For example, if it's something where I don't want to say minor, but say you have like an elderly person who fell. Generally, we would go in and help the EMTs as well, pick somebody up. But lately, because of the differences with having to wear the PPE, our fire department's taken that upon themselves. So what they do is they wear their turnout gear to fight fires because they have the mask with the oxygen, and it's a lot easier for them to disinfect their gear than it is us because our gear is porous. So the fire department's handling certain minor calls where they may need assistance with lifting a person rather than us going in. We're handling certain other calls where we can kind of resolve with maybe like a phone call or something like that. Hey, do you really need this or not? And I'm not saying just medical calls, but if it's a minor report, we can take it over the phone.
That's really interesting that you're coordinating with other first responders, and maybe you've always done that, but
we have always done it, but it's becoming more of definitely a coordinated effort between state, county, local, and federal partners, and what are the best practices. And every day it's changing though. So because we're always learning something new, our responses are changing as well. I think we've got it down to a decent working science now for the best practices, but every day there's a new policy or email that we have to sign to read, and it's kind of hard to keep track of everything as well.
So that learning curve that you were talking about earlier, from your perspective as a law enforcement officer, what are things that people can do to keep themselves safe, to facilitate the process of flattening the curve, etc.?
Yeah, again, obviously my experience is not in medicine or infectious disease, but from what I can suggest from a layman in this line of work, don't go out unnecessarily, because it creates a situation where obviously we have the quote unquote Karens calling in, knocking on everybody. For example, we've gotten calls about certain grocery stores that I guess weren't following social distancing properly per the order. I don't know how physically or 3 officers might be able to handle a gigantic store and telling them to properly do that. It might be something more where if you feel that there's an issue, maybe talk with the manager of a store first before calling the police. A lot of people resort to the last ditch effort, and I'm not saying don't call police, but sometimes it can be handled from a customer service standpoint rather than just, immediately having the police respond there. In addition, when they're saying for certain states, for example, avoid non-essential travel, that kind of helps because, we're still responding to collisions, obviously. And there's obviously a lot of people on the road who are essential. Truck drivers, I know certain states have lifted certain weight requirements and times that they can travel to get certain equipment to places. But the less people on the road, the better it is, because the less likelihood you're going to have a potential collision. If there is a collision, we still have to respond, and we still have to talk to people and grab their documents and be in close contact with them. And if there's an accident, we still have to work with that. So, and when I say accident, it's something where somebody's actually hurt, we still have to respond and get involved with them. So if it's something that's non-essential, you're putting yourself and others at risk as well for something that didn't need to happen. Obviously, if you're responding to, to places to go get food, or you're going to care for a loved one, we understand that. But that would be something that would help law enforcement officers. And just simple things of being like neighborly, if it's something where you can address an issue with your neighbor by a simple phone call or, a text message that doesn't need a police response, that would help. Obviously, if it escalates to the point where they tell you to go F yourself and you can't do that, by all means, call the police. But a lot of people are panicking, I think, and they're anxious and they don't know what to do. And a lot of times police are the first response to everything. And many times they're not needed for issues. So take a step back, think, slow down your approach. And this goes for anything, panicking never helps. So if you take that second to think and, what would be the best way to do this, you may be able to resolve the problem on your own, So, those would be some common sense tips that I would give.
Thank you for those. And it's occurring to me, you're saying that people are panicking, which is true. And in that sort of panicked energy, people want to do something when actually, based on what you just finished saying, oftentimes the best thing that people can do is nothing. So that's a hard thing to kind of wrap your mind around.
And like this just kind of came to light too. Obviously, police departments all over the country and world rely on, especially if they're using a community policing model, rely on their population, whether it's their residents or people in the town, to be the eyes and ears, to make the complaints about what they're seeing in the town. Be a good neighbor, make sure you're locking your car doors, make sure you're locking your doors. I can't tell you the amount of times I respond to calls for people just, whether it's oversights or they just feel like they're safe, that creates an issue where now they have a theft. Especially if you have that elderly neighbor who needs help, look out for them, shine an extra spotlight on their property just to potentially to avoid a potential theft. Check on your neighbors and stuff like that. Set your alarm. All these things help. It's all connected. So by being a good neighbor and reporting things that you're seeing, does something look out of place? Like, for example, we responded to what appeared to be an abandoned vehicle at a local business. Come to find out, it was a vehicle that was stolen out of another jurisdiction, out of state. So it was called in by a good Samaritan who just said, hey, this doesn't look right. I live near here and I've seen this vehicle here for several days. Like, that's good stuff, and that's being a good citizen and a good neighbor. I'm not saying narc on everybody, but keep an eye out for things that look out of the ordinary and let us know.
That sounds like common sense, sort of mixed with spidey sense, which makes sense to me. What have I not asked you, or what have you not had a chance to comment on that you think it's important for people to know?
Well, let me go over the list that you sent me because it was so long and comprehensive. Let me check here. What question are we on now, Val?
We are on question 7, so we haven't gotten to question 8 yet. You're
question 7.
You're giving people a peek behind the curtain. This is supposed to look very smooth and like it was just sort of casually put together, but that's okay.
Oh, I'm sorry. I didn't know that there was a NDA.
You know what? Leave it to a second-degree black belt to kind of, make that mistake.
Are you pulling rank now?
I'm just busting your chops, but it's not fun when you don't respond.
Sorry. I apologize. I think we covered a lot of the stuff. I'm trying to think. Did you have any other ad-lib questions you would like to ask?
Not that I can think of. I just wanted to make sure that you had the opportunity to scat and riff if you wanted to. But one last question that I do have for you is, what's the first thing you're going to do when the quarantine is lifted?
For me, obviously, I can't wait to see friends and family, give them a big hug. And next after that, it's going to be jiu-jitsu. I definitely want to get out. I was hiking up until a few weeks ago when they closed the state parks. So with the warmer weather, I definitely want to be outside and looking forward to getting a few beers and cocktails with friends in an outdoor setting.
That sounds good. I hope I'm included in at least part of that.
Potentially, but if you keep up that attitude, we'll have to see.
I'm sorry. So I'm not the ideal good Samaritan that you were talking about, but I'm not quite yet a Karen.
That's good.
Is that fair to say?
You're probably already in the Karen age, so it's only a natural downhill from here.
And I think I have a Karen haircut too, but that's through no fault of my own. So
I wouldn't say it's a Karen. I think we said it was in a post-apocalyptic librarian or something like that.
This is true. I'm post-apocalyptic librarian. So
yeah.
James, thank you so much for chatting with me about this. I think for at least people like me who are civilians, it's really useful to have a peek into what it is that you go through every day. And I really appreciate your willingness to chat with me. So thanks very much.
You're very welcome. Just everybody keep safe, and hopefully we'll see you guys when this lifts.
Sounds good. All right.